you looking for an internet talk radio station for your podcast? Look no further. At the helm of Passionate World Talk Radio are two women that want to provide a spot for you and your podcast to be heard. There are many other places for your podcast, but PWTR has the audience. You will not be disappointed. Our station has been on the internet for the past 16 years. Call us for more information. 484-364-1032 or text Jeannie White, station manager at PHECONNECTSHOW for podcast show details. Welcome to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain.
Hello, everybody. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio Network, where our mantra is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. The views of the guests may not represent those of the host or the station. Folks, I have a very special guest today. I am so honored and thrilled. If you are interested in art, if you're interested in history, whether you're Jewish or not, this book is for you. It's such an intense book, and I mean that in a good way. It is phenomenal. And I want to introduce my guest. My guest is Charles Dellheim, who is professor of history at Boston University. Welcome, Charles, to Chatting with Betsy. And let me say the name of the book. Get so excited. Belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Modern. There. Can't forget the title of the book.
Well, thank you, Betsy. Thanks for the very kind and generous words. And I'm so pleased to be here.
Well, thank you for coming on. I have to say, I do have a lot of questions, but the cover of your book, I know this is an audio interview, but people can go on Amazon and see your book. I have to ask the cover of the book first because I think it's beautiful.
Sure.
How did you come about that? Your cover, the painting, it's gorgeous.
As it happened years ago, before it occurred to me to actually write a book on this subject, I had a conversation with a friend and colleague of mine, Richard Cohn of Hebrew University. And he and I had been talking about possibly putting together an exhibit of portraits of all of the major Jewish art dealers and collectors in the late 19th and early 20th century. And there's a surprisingly large number. And he mentioned this portrait by Edward Vuillard of the brothers Bernheim. It's called The Art Dealers. And the painting was done in 1912. It turned out to be a kind of goodbye gift because Vuillard, who'd had an up and down relationship with the Bernheim brothers, ended up decamping for their cousin and longtime manager, a man named Jos Hessel. And part of this was that he knew Hessel and trusted him, and part of it was that Vuillard had been in love with Hessel's wife for years and was very much a member of the household. And it's a beautiful portrait, as you said, and it's in the St. Louis Art Museum. And I encourage people to go online and see it, or if you're in and around St. Louis, treat yourself. It's lush and spectacular, and the colors, I think, are magnificent.
Yes, I could imagine in person it's even more beautiful, than on a book cover, but I just think it's a beautiful color, a beautiful book cover. Charles, why did you write this book?
Well, that's a really good question. At various times when I was slogging through it and it wasn't going so well, I asked myself that question almost every day, which is not a good thing. So basically why I wrote it is in the late 1990s, there was a dramatic resurgence of interest in the fate of Nazi stolen art. It was not only a story to be told, but it was a problem to be solved. And there was a sudden public consciousness for a variety of reasons of the astounding number of works of art that had been ransacked by the Nazis from Jewish collections that had never been returned to either to the collectors themselves or to their rightful heirs. And I was immediately drawn into this story, first because I am a historian of modern European cultural history, but perhaps still more because my father and his family were German Jewish refugees. And my father left in April 1938 with his sister. He was 15, she was 16, and they came to New York. And this kind of story of dispossession or of betrayal, which really wasn't much talked about in my household, was probably simmering in my unconscious. But more to the point in terms of the book, as these controversies came to light, I followed all of them, but I also thought there was something essential being neglected. A lot was being said about the ownership of works of art, but very little was being said about the people who owned them. How did they come to acquire so much great art in the first place? And the reason it's such an interesting story is that really until the 19th century, Jews were cultural outsiders. They were on the margins of European civilization. And rather suddenly, in the late 19th and early 20th century, Jews come to play a pivotal role in the art world, both in the world of old master paintings, Titian, Raphael, Leonardo, Rembrandt, and especially in the world of modern art, the successive schools of modern art from Manet and the Impressionists through Picasso and the Cubists. And though I didn't write about them, because it goes beyond my story, through the abstract expressionists and the new American painters. And I wanted to know how this happened. And I wanted to know about the life, the work, and the milieu of these people. So that's how I decided to write the book.
How long did it take you to write this book? Because, it's intensive. A lot of research went into this book.
Well, I'd like to say that I was blonde when the book started, but in fact, I was never blonde. I started writing it in 2001, but I didn't really have much time for it. I was the chair of the history department at Boston University, and I'd come to take that job, and then I was the architect of a university-wide honors college. So I didn't have a lot of time to work on the book, and the book went through a couple of drafts, none of which were really satisfactory. And part of the time a lot of the time went into research in 14 archives on both sides of the Atlantic, from this beautiful Villa I Tatti outside of Florence to the equally beautiful, if not more so, Getty Museum. So it took me a long time because, aside from my own teaching and administrative duties, not to mention life in general, wife, 2 daughters, and a couple of Labradors at various points, it was hard to figure out how to tell the story, because the story really spans 2 continents, Europe and the United States, and it stretches from the late 19th century to the present. And figuring out a way how to turn this into a compelling narrative which would hopefully appeal to anybody who is interested in history and art, proved to be a lot more complicated than I thought.
And what would you like the reader to take away from your book? I know there's a lot to take away, but what would you like the reader to take away?
Well, what people take away from books or art really begins with what they bring to them and their own interests and their own experiences. But what I want them to understand is that Jews played a vital role in the making of great American art collections, most of which ended up in museums. So whether it's the Huntington or the Frick or the Gardner or the great collections of the Metropolitan in New York and the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the people I write about were instrumental in bringing these great works of art from Europe, from aristocratic collections, to the new rich, the capitalist new rich in the United States. And they also play an enormous role in the triumph of modern art. These were people who were unusually receptive to new forms of aesthetic expression. And what's interesting about them as individuals is, well, it's a lot of things, but there are two things that really stand out. And one is that many of the people I write about come from pretty modest backgrounds. Nathan Wildenstein started life as a horse dealer. Joel Duveen sold vegetable produce. Alfred Fleshtheim was a grain dealer. Daniel Kahnweiler was a very unhappy stockbroker and commercial merchandiser in finance. And none of these people, with one or two exceptions, were trained in the fine arts. Very few of them had university education. These were people who taught themselves by going to museum after museum, gallery after gallery, looking at picture after picture and immersing themselves in objects and acquiring just astonishing eyes. And these are people who were bringing art, whether it's the old masters or modern art, to the public, creating a public. And not just the collectors who were smart enough and lucky enough to acquire these works of art, but to all of us who end up going to museums. And the other thing that I want people to come away with, which is probably the main thing, is to understand the profound Jewish desire to belong and to succeed. And, those are desires I think most of us have. But they were a little different for Jews because the emancipation of Jews gave them political rights, they gave them legal rights, but they were still pretty much on the periphery of their society. And art becomes a means of belonging. It becomes a passport to civilization. It becomes a source of beauty, of pleasure and meaning. But it also becomes an emblem of national citizenship, showing that they too are really French or English or German or Austrian. But it also becomes a badge of cosmopolitan sympathies, that these were people with broad knowledge, broad understanding, and that their role in European civilization had a lot to do with their origins, but the role they end up taking made them creative forces in their society. So that's belonging, though it's, as you might imagine, a lot more complicated than that.
Yes.
And then there's the betrayal.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and the betrayal is, the basic promise of emancipation, assimilation, acculturation is learn our language, adopt our customs, immerse yourselves in our culture, dispense with outward signs of difference, and we will accept you more or less. That was the bargain. That was the social contract. But what happens in Germany with the rise of Nazism, what happens all over Europe as the Germans topple one country after another on the continent is that contract is utterly breached. And the Nazis deny the humanity of Jews. They deny Jews a sense of beauty, the ability to appreciate art. They deny Jews their citizenship, and while stripping them of their citizenship, they also strip them of all of their possessions, money, gold, household furniture, businesses large and small, and of works of art that had great meaning for families, the art that children grew up with, the art that their parents or their grandparents acquired after a financial struggle. And there's something very poignant to me about that story, because it's a story of rise and fall. It's a story of possession and dispossession. And on a human level, it's a story that I personally found very powerful.
Yes, and Charles, we have Passionate World Talk Radio Network, a very varied audience. A lot of millennials listen. And I have to say, this might be a different type of interview that you're used to because I'm Jewish. So I totally relate to what you're saying. My relatives came over, my grandparents from Europe, different sections of Europe, and kicked off their land. This is before World War I. And, you know, you're right. The Jews were not accepted in Europe. And we can't forget what the Nazis did to Jews and other people, but they, you know, dehumanized a Jewish person and the way they would do their brainwashing. And they didn't fit in, you know, they tried to fit into European culture and society, but they really weren't fully 100% accepted. And I just wanted the audience to know that. I know from my own family history, they were not. Except that's why they fled for their lives.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
I think one of the things about this story is this is a story about a minority that faces systematic discrimination, and a minority that is trying to find its way in the larger society to make their mark, to win social acceptance. And I think that story has resonance for a lot of minorities. But whether you're a minority or not, I think it has a lot of implications because we are dealing every day in this country with the burden of discrimination, of the memory of slavery, the barriers put up by Jim Crow. And I think that to be able to understand both the paths to success of a minority, of a beleaguered group, but also the perils of success. Because what happened to Jews is that as they became prominent in the art world, they represented a threat to their competitors. They represented a threat to those who felt that they didn't really belong there. And I think that is a story with a lot of relevance to what's happening in America today and what's happening in Europe today. And I don't mean just to Jewish people. I think that what we learn from this story is a lot about barriers and how barriers can be overcome, but also about the sheer difficulty of winning acceptance and of being treated as a human being with, you know, certain different practices or heritage. But it's really a story about how art touches our common humanity. And I think that's essential right now.
Yes. We can reach people through art, music, anything with the arts. And I had to bring this up, Charles, because this was in my local paper, and I thought of you, and I thought of your book. It's a Van Gogh artwork looted by Nazis to be auctioned in New York. It's a painting of wheat stacks. And it's going to, auctioned, I don't know what they got for it, but they asked for $20 million, folks. So just want to put this in perspective of what the Nazis took from people, and how did they, I know there was the, movie, The Monument Men, and they went and they, found these lost art pieces. Were they given back to the rightful owner, or were they put in art museums?
That's a really good question, and it's a complicated one. So towards the end of the war, there was the formation of this Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives group, and they start out with dealing with historic monuments because there's understandable concern that they may be bombed during war. And then they gradually discover the extent of art looting, and they're able to recover some enormous caches of Nazi stolen art. But then they make a decision, which is made not by the officers, but by officials in Washington, which is to repatriate, that is, to bring the stolen art back to its country of origin. And they did that because the monuments men really didn't have local knowledge of who owned what or a mechanism to return art. But the problem was that left a mountain of art, including truly great masterpieces, in the hands of national museums. And while a certain amount of art was returned, there was a French commission on art recuperation, and it did have a certain amount of success, but there were thousands of works of art that were never returned, either because owners couldn't be found, because they couldn't try hard enough. Some owners were dead, but it was also that many of these works of art went into museums, and a lot of works of art were put on the market after the war. And unfortunately, a lot of museums and galleries and collectors were not as scrupulous as they should have been about the provenance or the wartime history of these works of art. Every work of art which is reputable will have a provenance or its history of ownership. And if there's a gap somewhere between 1933 and 1945, chances were it didn't fall off a truck. It might have fallen off a Nazi train, but not off of a truck. And some countries were very, very slow to return stolen art. Austria is one example. The Netherlands, another example. So this story isn't done. And what happens after the war is individual collectors, individual dealers try to recover their art, and the big-time ones have some success. They're more likely to have documentation. They're more likely to have connections, whereas someone who owned a couple of pictures, well, that person might really be out of luck. But then after the late 1940s, this flurry of interest in the return of stolen assets dies down. And while certain families continue the struggle to find stolen art, it's no longer a public issue. And then for a variety of reasons, it becomes a public issue in the late 1990s, and there are signal victories. The long-delayed restitution of Gustav Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I, which was painted in 1907, and now hangs in the Neue Gallery in New York City. But even though it would stand to reason that after really 2 decades of intensive scrutiny, that the story of restitution would just die down, it hasn't happened. There are new cases, there are new controversies, and there are still works of art whose ownership is disputed. And it's hard to know how these things are ultimately going to be resolved. Some cases are very murky. Some cases are very clear. And it's hard to generalize about them. Museums, galleries, auction houses are doing a better job than they used to of checking the provenance of works of art. That's largely because of public pressure and the embarrassment that some museums and auction houses faced in the late 90s and early 2000s for not having vetted works of art that were stolen by the Nazis. And this is a very difficult process, and I'm not just blaming these institutions wholesale. That would be very unfair. Some of them have done a very good job. But finding works of art is difficult. I have a friend and a neighbor outside of Boston where we live, and his family were German refugees, and they were a very well-off family, and they owned a couple of Bruegels, Flemish old masters, and they have been searching for them, and thus far without success. So this is a story that's not going to be settled easily, despite a lot of goodwill and a lot of great effort on the part of a variety of individuals and institutions.
It's just an incredible book. I have to ask you this, Charles. I don't know if you'd be able to answer. I just thought of it at the top of my head. When the Nazis stole all this art and they hid it, what were they going to do with it? Do you have any idea? I mean, if they would have won the war?
I do. So, with the modern works of art, which the Nazis condemned as degenerate, some were destroyed, which is just a tragedy. Some were sold on the art market, especially in Switzerland, to raise currency for the war effort. And some were traded for northern old masters, Holbeins, Rembrandts, things that the Nazis believed falsely were truly Aryan works of art. Other works of art, the most valuable ones, are picked up by the Nazi brass. The best ones go to Hitler, and Hitler had a dream of building a museum in Linz in Austria, in his hometown, and a lot of the stolen works of art were designated for Linz. But other Nazis, Goering, who was actually a very accomplished collector, went to the Jeu de Paume, this little jewel of a museum in Paris, which the Nazis used as a kind of depot or repository for stolen art. He made trip after trip to the Jeu de Paume, and he just chose the works of art that he wanted and took them, never paid for them. And art was very much part of Nazis' grandiose cultural ambitions. It wasn't enough to conquer every country in Europe to create what they thought would be this 1,000-year Reich. They also wanted control of culture, and in particular of works of art. So we do know a great deal about what happened to that. And my friend and colleague, Jonathan Petropoulos, has written some terrific books on this subject, most recently a book called Goering's Man in Paris, which really tells this darkly enthralling story of what Nazi dealers did during the war.
It's just so mind-boggling, and you were so interesting to chat with, Charles. I could chat with you for forever, but can you explain what degenerate art is versus modern art?
Well, I think there's really this I can give you a short answer, which is Nazis. So degenerate art, which in German was called entartete Kunst, was the Nazi propaganda term for modern art. And they believed that modern art was degenerate because it was Jewish, and it was Jewish because it was degenerate. So it's about as good an example of circular reasoning as you could get to. The Nazis had a very traditional view of art, and they believed that modern art was violating all of the great traditions of classical art. And their taste was for kind of glorification of the German body. And they believed that this modern art was degenerate because it was not racially pure. And degenerate art included German expressionists, whether it was George Grosz or Max Ernst. It included Monet, Picasso, and Matisse, and it was all characterized crazily as Jewish art, though there was nothing Jewish about it, any more than there was anything that was specifically Christian about it. But it was seen as a threat, as a corrosive part of German society that had to be purged. And when the Nazis come to power, they eject almost all of the museum directors and curators, except for those who were Nazis, and there were a few, or those who were willing to become Nazis. And then in 1936, 1937, they purge all of this modern or degenerate art from German museums and galleries, about 16,000 works. And they put a certain number of examples of these works on display, first in Munich in July 1937, for this horrific art exhibition in which these modern works of art are, they're stripped of their frames, they're hung on cords like it's a public execution. They are branded as works of blasphemy, as a corruption of German womanhood, as a threat to the German people. And this was not like an art show. It was like a Stalin-esque show trial in which people went to this show not for contemplation or enlightenment or education. The purpose of the show was to incite the German people against those who painted this art, who collected this art, against the museum directors who chose this art. And one of the bizarre things about the show was the price of the work of art was displayed on the label, and often the wrong price. And the tagline would be stolen from the hard-earned pennies of the German taxpayer. So this is a way of inciting rage, and that's what happened. And the show traveled all around Germany, and it attracted an enormous number of visitors. There were always queues outside. And the irony of it is that when the show begins in Munich in July 1937, really right across the street, the Nazis put on a show about what they considered to be desirable German art. And by comparison, hardly anyone went. They really weren't interested. What they were interested in was condemnation and anger and in inciting violence, which they did. as we know.
Yes, yeah, that's really a shame and a lesson that we should not forget. You know, as a child, I was taught about the Holocaust or the horror movies. I was never told about the lost art. I really didn't hear about it. I think it probably was the 90s or in 2000 when you heard about the lost art. So I had to thank you from the bottom of my heart, Charles, for writing this book and educating everyone about the history of Jewish art and what Jewish artists went through and what happened to their art. My own personal opinion, Charles, I hope you consider sending this to get a movie made. I think a movie should be made about your book.
Well, it's very, very kind of you to say, Betsy, and you're very generous. But if I could just say one last thing briefly.
Sure.
It's something I tell my own students, and be very careful about cancel culture. Be very careful about censorship, because if you want the classic case of what it is to burn books, what it is to say, this is pure, that's impure, look at the Nazis. And while the intentions are very good, and they're often humane and honorable, when you begin to censor literature, art, philosophy, to say what's pure and what's not, bad things are going to happen.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. And, we could see it starting now. And so I 100% agree with you, Charles. Charles, where can people buy your book? Amazon? Is there anywhere else?
Sure. They can buy it directly from the University of Chicago Press or from Brandeis. Perhaps the best place to buy it is book.org, so that they can support their independent bookstores. With all due respect to Amazon, I don't think they need any more money. But book.org, I think, is especially good because, these independent bookstores, like a lot of businesses in this country, have struggled, especially in the last year and a half with the pandemic. And these are people who are out there to do good things and to contribute to the, all of our continuing education. So book.org, University of Chicago, Brandeis, and kidding aside, you can get it from Amazon too, of course.
And Charles, is there, do you have a media contact link if people wanted to get in touch with you?
Sure.
You don't have to.
They can always email me at my Boston University email, which is all lowercase, Dellheim@bu.edu. I will try to write back as soon as possible, but I'm afraid I don't have a web page or site or anything like that. I mean,
that's okay. That's all right. I don't either. I don't have a website myself. Charles Dellheim, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for coming on, chatting with Betsy. I feel very honored and privileged to have you on. And I also want to tell the audience, because I forgot before because I get so excited, that Charles Dellheim wrote other books: The Face of the Past, The Preservation of the Medieval Inheritance in Victorian England, and The Disenchanted Isle, Mrs. Thatcher's Capitalist Revolution. So this is not Charles Dellheim's first book. It's the first one that I've read, but I think, check out Charles Dellheim's other books. Definitely go and purchase this book, Belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Modern. And, yes, I am passionate, and yes, is passionate for me because I am Jewish. I'm not ashamed to say that I am. And, we have a very beautiful history. And I just, want to thank you, Charles, for writing this book to educate everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Betsy. It's been an honor and a real pleasure. Thank you for your time and your interest.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. My pleasure. Folks, if you missed any of this podcast, you can catch it on your favorite podcast outlets. I'm also, to name a few, CastBox, Spreaker, Spotify, Amazon.com. And please subscribe to Chatting with Betsy. It's free, so you will hear interesting guests. You never know who I will have on. And I want to thank Jeannie White, who is the station manager, Passionate World Talk Radio Network, for writing a blog and producing the show. Please read the blog. It will have information. And I want to thank Lillian Caldwell, CEO at Passionate World Talk Radio Network. I also want to do a public service announcement. This is November. It is National Caregivers Month and National Alzheimer's Month. Now, I'm an advocate. If you know a caregiver, please reach out to one. Please show the love this month and every month. A caregiver, see if you can help them. Don't wait for them to ask you if you know they need help. Reach out. Bring a covered dish over. Drop in a gift card or something. You can say hello. It means so much to a caregiver to know that they're thought about. And educate yourself on Alzheimer's. I can't impress that enough. There's no cure, folks. There's no treatment. Educate yourself on Alzheimer's. And if you think you're having memory problems, go talk to your healthcare provider. And until we chat again, this is Betsy Wurzel, host of Chatting with Betsy and Passionate World Talk Radio Network. Remember, in a world where you could be anything, please be kind. Bye-bye now.
Are you looking for an internet talk radio station for your podcast? Look no further. At the helm of Passionate World Talk Radio are two women that want to provide a spot for you and your podcast to be heard. There are many other places for your podcast, but PWTR has the audience. You will not be disappointed. Our station has been on the internet for the past 16 years. Call us for more information. 484-364-1032 or text Jeannie White, station manager, at PHECONNECTSHOW@gmail.com for podcast show details. Thank you for listening to Passionate World Talk Radio. You can listen to this program all over again by going over to https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. You can also hear it on Spotify, Spreaker, Amazon ALEXA, AMFM247.com every Tuesday evening between 8 and 9 p.m. YouTube, Facebook, Facebook Live, LinkedIn, and all the other podcast directories one can find on the Internet.